What if the most consequential translation in the history of archaeology happened 5 years ago in a basement storage room at the British Museum, was published in an academic journal almost no one reads, and was immediately followed by the complete professional disappearance of every researcher who worked on it? That is not a hypothetical. The tablet exists. The translation exists. The journal publication exists. And the lead translator, a senior Oxford researcher who had spent 2 decades studying cuneiform texts, retired abruptly 6 months after the paper came out. When contacted by colleagues asking about his work, he sent back 4 words: "We translated it correctly." Then he stopped responding entirely. The tablet had been sitting in the British Museum's storage archives since 1876, pulled from the ruins of Nippur in what is now southern Iraq, catalogued, photographed once, and then classified as too fragile to handle and too damaged to read. Museum records listed it as catastrophically compromised. The cuneiform text corrupted by moisture and time, the surface coated in protective resin that made physical examination impossible. It was filed alongside more than 130,000 other untranslated Sumerian tablets, gathering dust in museum storage, and it stayed there for over 140 years. In 2019, a research team gained access to it using multispectral imaging technology originally developed for NASA satellite analysis. Infrared and ultraviolet light at specific wavelengths penetrated the resin coating without physical contact and made the cuneiform impressions visible for the first time. What the imaging revealed was not another administrative record, not a grain inventory or a temple offering list. What it revealed was a document describing something the Sumerians called the return cycle, a specific astronomical configuration that would signal when they come back. And according to the translation, that configuration is not thousands of years away. It is approaching within this decade. If ancient texts and the discoveries that keep rewriting what we thought we knew about human history are what you are here for, subscribe now. I cover this kind of material every week, and what I am about to walk you through is one of the most significant translation findings in the modern study of Sumerian civilization. In this video, we are going to work through 4 questions this tablet forces us to ask. First, what does the text actually say? And why does its astronomical precision exceed what Sumerian civilization should have been capable of producing by several orders of magnitude? Second, what is the return cycle the tablet describes? And how does the celestial alignment it identifies connect to the moment Sumerian civilization first appeared in the archaeological record? Third, what do the tablet's descriptions of the Anunnaki, the Me, and the bloodline markers tell us about how the Sumerians understood their own origin? And why does that understanding align with anomalies in the modern human genome that remain unexplained? And fourth, why did the lead translator retire within 6 months of publication? Why have his co-authors refused all on-record comment? And why has the British Museum denied every subsequent request to independently verify the imaging data? Let's start with what we know about the tablet before the 2019 translation. The artifact is now catalogued in the British Museum's digital archive under the designation MS3848. It was recovered from Nippur, one of the most important sacred cities in all of ancient Sumer. The tablet dates to approximately the early 2nd millennium BCE, a date confirmed by radiocarbon analysis of organic residue in the clay and by the style of the cuneiform script itself. When the multispectral imaging team processed the results, they found text written in a mixed dialect, Akkadian combined with older Sumerian loan terms. In the densely precise register, the Sumerians reserved for technical and astronomical documents. Not mythology, not religious hymn, the kind of register they used for star charts and engineering specifications. What the text describes is a celestial alignment, a configuration of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the constellation now called Aquarius, combined with the position of Venus relative to the Pleiades star cluster, cross-referenced against the precessional cycle of the Earth's axis. The tablet then states, in language the translation team rendered as directly as the source material allowed, that when the wandering stars align in the house of the water-bearer, and the bright one stands at the shoulder of the seven sisters, the path opens. The Anunnaki, who departed in the time of great waters, shall return as they promised. The team fed the astronomical coordinates into software used by NASA to reconstruct historical and future star positions. The alignment the tablet describes is not a common configuration. The last time it occurred was approximately 3100 BCE. The next time it occurs is 2029. 3100 BCE is significant. That is the window immediately preceding the explosion of Sumerian civilization in the archaeological record. One moment, there are scattered agricultural settlements in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates. The next, there is a full urban civilization with written language, advanced mathematics, sophisticated astronomical observation systems, irrigation infrastructure, metallurgy, codified law, and city planning at a scale that rivals modern construction. Archaeologists have a name for this problem. They call it the Sumerian problem. How does a civilization emerge fully formed, without the developmental trail that every other known civilization leaves behind in the archaeological record? The Sumerians answered that question themselves in text after text, with consistent clarity. The knowledge came from the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, not as metaphor, as a physical description of beings who descended from above and transmitted the foundational knowledge of civilization to a human population that had not developed it independently. The Sumerian King List, one of the most analyzed documents in ancient Near Eastern scholarship, records rulers who reigned for thousands of years before the Great Flood. Then it uses an exact phrase that translators have wrestled with for decades. The kingship was lowered from heaven. After the flood, human kings ruled for normal lifespans. The document draws a clear and deliberate line between two distinct eras. Before, when beings with lifespans measured in millennia governed directly. After, when humans governed alone. The King List does not treat this as mythology. It treats it as administrative history, in the same register it uses to record grain taxes and territorial boundaries. The mainstream response to this has always been the same. The Sumerians were brilliant observers who developed their astronomical knowledge through careful and sustained skywatching over generations. The long-lived kings are poetic exaggeration meant to legitimize royal bloodlines. The Anunnaki are anthropomorphized natural forces. That explanation requires ignoring specific things the Sumerians knew that they should not have known. They tracked Venus across a 500-year period with calculations that differ from modern measurements by only a few hours. They produced star charts depicting planets that were not identified by Western science until the invention of the telescope. They described Saturn as surrounded by a ring system. They placed the Sun at the center of the solar system 4,000 years before Copernicus published his heliocentric model. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, the 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's rotational axis that requires centuries of precise astronomical records to detect, let alone calculate. This is not the knowledge profile of a civilization that emerged from Neolithic farming communities in the space of a few generations. This is the knowledge profile of a civilization that had access to an external source. And the sealed tablet identifies what that source was, when it arrived, and when it is scheduled to return. If the history that gets buried, suppressed, or filed away in museum storage for a century and a half is what you want to keep following, subscribe now, and make sure you do not miss the next one. I put this out every week. The tablet's description of the return sequence is procedural. That is the word the translation team used in their published paper. Not prophetic, not poetic, procedural. It reads like a set of operational instructions describing a staged process. The first to arrive are called the Watchers. They precede the main return to prepare the way. The text says they move among men unseen, taking measure of what has been built, what has been forgotten. They mark those who carry the old blood. The line unbroken since the time of mixing. The time of mixing is not an obscure Sumerian reference. It appears across multiple texts, always describing the same event. The Anunnaki, at some point in the remote past, deliberately altered the genetics of the human population they had created as a workforce. They mixed their own biological material with that of the existing human species to produce a modified population. The resulting population became the priest-king class, the hybrid bloodlines that governed the early Sumerian cities, and that the king list tracks with genealogical precision going back to the Anunnaki themselves. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written narratives in human history, describes its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, not as metaphor for greatness. The text is literal. His mother is Ninsun, an Anunnaki figure. His father is a human king. Gilgamesh is described as possessing physical capabilities and a lifespan that exceed normal human parameters as a biological consequence of his mixed heritage. The text treats this as a factual characteristic of his physiology, not a narrative embellishment. In 2003, the Human Genome Project produced a finding that the mainstream scientific community has since handled with significant caution. Human DNA contains segments that do not match the gradual mutation profile seen in other species across evolutionary timescales. Sequences that appear, in the language of the researchers who identified them, to have been inserted rather than evolved. Sections of the genome where the normal markers of incremental mutation are absent, where the genetic material appears to have arrived fully formed. The mainstream interpretation is that these sequences arrived through horizontal gene transfer from ancient viral infections. But the distribution of these segments, their concentration in regions associated with cognition, language processing, and fine motor control, has never been fully accounted for by the horizontal transfer model. The sealed tablet says the Watchers, when they arrive ahead of the main return, will identify and mark those who still carry the unbroken bloodline from the time of mixing. Whatever the biological marker of that bloodline is, the Sumerians believed it was detectable. The Watchers knew how to find it, and the tablet implies that what happens to individuals after the return depends on whether they carry it. The me appear in this section of the tablet in a context that adds detail to how they appear in other Sumerian texts. The me were not abstract concepts. Multiple Sumerian texts describe them as physical objects that could be held, stolen, transported, and transferred. In one of the most well-known Sumerian narratives, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu, gets the god Enki intoxicated, and steals the me from him, transporting them by boat to her own city of Uruk. The narrative is describing a physical theft of physical objects that contained the foundational knowledge of civilization: mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine. Whoever held the me held the operating system of advanced civilization in a transferable form. The sealed tablet says the gatekeepers, the second wave of returning beings who follow the Watchers, carry the me of renewal, the patterns that remake what was broken. The text says those who remember the old covenants will be called. Those who forgot will be left to the rising waters. The Epic of Atrahasis, which predates the biblical flood account by a significant margin, describes the Anunnaki convening and deciding to eliminate the human population because it had grown too numerous. One Anunnaki, Enki, violated that decision. He warned a human named Atrahasis about what was coming and gave him specific instructions. After the flood, the surviving Anunnaki decided to reduce human fertility and limit human lifespan. The modified genetics from the time of mixing were partially rolled back. the sealed tablet, connects the flood to the return cycle explicitly. The rising waters the text references when describing those who will be left behind are not a metaphor for divine judgment. They are a described consequence of Nibiru's orbital approach. The tablet attributes specific physical effects to the passage of a large planetary body through the inner solar system. Gravitational destabilization, increased tectonic activity, electromagnetic interference, atmospheric disruption. The same pattern of effects, the text says, preceded the Great Flood. The same pattern will precede the return. Earth's magnetic field has been weakening at a measurable and accelerating rate for decades. The magnetic North Pole has been drifting at an unprecedented speed. The weakening and displacement of the magnetic field is documented in peer-reviewed geophysical literature without controversy. What remains controversial is the cause and what it signals about the field's behavior in the near future. The tablet describes the electromagnetic signs as the first physical confirmation that the return cycle is active. The tablet's second section identifies a set of secondary markers that precede the return. It says that in the seasons before the alignment completes, the earth groans with increasing fury. Mountains that slept since the time of the great cold awaken with fire. The seas rise and swallow the coasts where men built their towers of pride. Sickness moves through the nations unseen, carried by the very air, without cure in the hands of the healers. Volcanic activity globally has been measurably increasing. Sea level rise is documented, accelerating and affecting precisely the coastal urban centers the tablet describes as the Towers of Pride. A global respiratory pandemic requiring years of societal disruption has occurred within this decade. None of these events, taken individually, is evidence of anything beyond natural variation. The tablet does not describe these as supernatural punishments. It describes them as physical consequences of an astronomical event. The same effects, it says, preceded the flood. The third section of the tablet describes the Anunnaki's evaluation criteria for the civilization they returned to find. They created humanity as a workforce. The Sumerians are explicit about this across multiple texts. The Sumerian texts say the Anunnaki required gold for purposes the documents never fully specify. They created a modified human population to extract it, administer their facilities, and maintain the infrastructure of the cities they had constructed. The Adamu, a term that passed through Akkadian and Hebrew into the name Adam. Not a single individual, a created category of being. A workforce shaped from existing biological material. The tablet says the returning Anunnaki will evaluate their creation against two criteria. The first is technological capability, specifically the ability to project beyond the planet's surface and to communicate across vast distances. The second is what the text calls the quality of the covenant, whether humanity has moved beyond the tribal conflict and ecological destruction that characterized the populations the flood was used to reset in the previous cycle. By the first standard, humanity in the 21st century qualifies. Humans have left the planet. We have sent instruments beyond the solar system. We communicate instantaneously across the globe. By the second criterion, the question is harder to resolve. The tablet does not specify a quantitative threshold. It says the watchers will take measure and deliver the count. The gatekeepers will act on that count. The two outcomes the tablet describes are ascension and cleansing. Ascension means the Anunnaki apply a second round of genetic modification, this time upgrading rather than creating, unlocking capabilities that were embedded in the original design, but constrained during the initial modification. Extended lifespan, enhanced cognitive range, the evolutionary acceleration that natural selection would require hundreds of thousands of years to produce, delivered through directed biological intervention. Cleansing is what happened before, a reset. The flood was a cleansing. The tablet implies that fire, atmospheric collapse, and epidemic are alternative methods available in the current cycle. The tablet does not specify which outcome will occur. It says the Watchers will determine that. It says the count will decide it. The eyewitness account that appears in the final section of MS3848 is written in a different hand from the main text. It reads as a personal record rather than a copied document. And it is the section that the lead translator described in his only post-retirement communication as the part of the translation that he found most difficult to sit with professionally. The scribe writes that in the 14th year of the reign of King Ur-Nammu, which places the account at approximately 2100 BCE, 3 beings descended at night. Their craft, silent as falling stars. They stood taller than any warrior. They wore faces that appeared human. They spoke the oldest form of the Sumerian language, the dialect of the first city, a dialect that by the time of Ur-Nammu was already archaic. They asked for the king. They examined the grain stores, the heights of the ziggurat, the star charts the city had preserved. They did not speak of when they would return. They said only the cycle continues. We are not forgotten. The tablet was sealed and placed in protective resin shortly after this account was recorded. That sequence of events is worth sitting with. A scribe witnesses something, documents it, and then the entire tablet is sealed in resin and filed in a way that will prevent it from being read for 4,000 years. That is not how administrative records are treated. That is not how religious texts are preserved. That is how something is hidden, deliberately, carefully, and with the expectation that it will remain hidden for a specific period of time. The British Museum has refused every subsequent request from independent researchers to access the original tablet. The institution cites fragility concerns. The multispectral imaging dataset used in the translation has not been released for independent verification. The researchers who translated it have declined all on-record comment. In the one statement, one of them made to a colleague, the words used were that the translation stands as published, and that interpretation is beyond its scope. Interpretation is not beyond the scope of archaeologists. It is the primary purpose of their work. That statement, from a senior researcher declining to interpret a text she translated, suggests that the interpretation was clear enough that saying it out loud carried consequences she was not willing to accept. Either the Sumerians possessed astronomical and mathematical capabilities that exceed what we have credited them with, which requires a complete rewriting of what we know about ancient scientific development. Or they were working from a source that provided those calculations to them. A source that already knew where the planets would be 4,000 years in the future, because it understood celestial mechanics at a level that Bronze Age civilization could not have reached independently. The tablet does not tell us which of those answers is correct. It only tells us what the calculation produces. The alignment is coming, the cycle is completing. And whoever or whatever set that cycle in motion left detailed instructions in clay for the population that would still be here when the alignment arrived. The clay is still here. The text has been read. The date is on the table. Whether anyone with institutional authority is willing to engage with what that means is a separate question. The British Museum has the tablet behind a fragility classification. The imaging data is not publicly available. The researchers who did the work are not talking, and the alignment the work identified is 6 years away. If this is the kind of history you want to keep following, the video on screen right now covers another piece of the Sumerian record that connects directly to what you just heard. Click it now, and if you are not subscribed yet, do it before the next one comes out. I release something new every week, and what comes next builds on everything this video established. The people who catch it early are always the ones who see where it is going before everyone else does.